Before there were cities, temples, nations, or religions, many of the world's creation stories began with something remarkably similar. There's darkness, there's water, there is an unformed world, and then something moves. In the Genesis creation story, Genesis 1:2 says, "The earth was, or perhaps had become, tohu vavohu," usually translated without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. Waters covered the earth. And over these waters moves the Ruach Elohim. Ruach means wind, breath, spirit. Then separation begins. The waters are gathered, dry land appears, and the world becomes a place that can be inhabited. But Israel wasn't the only culture that imagined creation this way. In ancient Babylon, creation begins with primordial waters. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk confronts Tiamat, who represents the primordial sea. And what does Marduk use against her? Wind. He releases the winds, divides the primordial body of Tiamat, and from that separation, the ordered cosmos is established. The story isn't Genesis, but listen to the pattern. Primordial waters, wind, separation, creation. Travel west into Egypt, and we find another version. Before the ordered world is Nun, the primordial waters. There is Shu. Shu represents air, and Shu stands between Geb, the earth, and Nut, the heavens, separating them and creating the space in which the ordered world can exist. Again, primordial waters, air, separation, creation. Travel north into the Old Finnish tradition preserved in the Kalevala. There we meet Ilmatar, the maiden of the air. She descends into the primordial sea. The wind moves upon her, and eventually the world takes shape from the cosmology. Once again, we find water, wind, movement, creation. Other traditions tell it differently. Sometimes a deity stirs the primordial waters. Sometimes heaven and earth are pulled apart. Sometimes breath gives life rather than exposing land. And we should not pretend that all of these stories are identical. They aren't. But beneath many of them is an ancient intuition. Creation begins when something moves. Something invisible disturbs what was still. Something separates what had been joined. Something brings distinction out of the undifferentiated. And suddenly, the imagery of Genesis becomes much more interesting because the Ruach doesn't disappear after Genesis 1. After the flood, Genesis 1:8 says, God made a Ruach to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. There it is again. Water, Ruach, dry land, a new beginning. And then Israel reaches the sea in Exodus. They're trapped. The water is in front of them. The old life is behind them. And Exodus 14:21 says that Yahweh caused the sea to go back by a strong Ruach. The water moves, dry ground appears, and humanity walks through. Again, water, Ruach, dry land, new life. Creation, recreation, liberation. The same image keeps returning. And then something extraordinary happens to this ancient symbol. The cosmic story becomes a human story. Wind becomes breath. The invisible force moves across the waters, becomes the invisible breath, moving through us. Hebrews has Ruach, Greece has pneumana, wind, breath, spirit. Latin gives us spiritus, breath or spirit. India speaks of prana, the vital breath, and vaya, the wind. Different cultures, different languages, different theologies. We should not pretend these words all mean exactly the same thing, but perhaps the people who came before us noticed something we sometimes overlooked. You cannot see the wind, you know it by what moves. You cannot hold your breath in your hand, yet without it, the body cannot live. And perhaps that is why the wind and the breath become such powerful images of the divine. Because the invisible is not necessarily absent. Sometimes you recognize the invisible by watching what happens when it passes through. And perhaps creating isn't only something that happened billions of years ago. Perhaps creation happens every time the Ruach moves across the chaos within us. When confusion begins to separate, when something buried finally emerges, when a path appears where moments before we could only see water. Remember what Genesis says. It doesn't say that God created dry land at that moment. It says, let dry land appear. Maybe sometimes the Spirit doesn't need to create something new in you. Maybe the Ruach simply moves what has been covering what was already there. Because across thousands of years of human storytelling, one image keeps appearing. There was waters, something moved, and a world appeared.